it's interesting. You and I both have a background in philosophy, and when I start thinking about concepts like leadership, I end up going back to Aristotle and thinking about his account of phronesis and practical wisdom. And when you start thinking about, well, what are the characteristics of the person who's practically wise? Aristotle says, well, you go and find the person and you see what those characteristics are. And there's something about that, I think, when it comes to leadership, that it's difficult in many ways to teach it, but I think when you see it, and when you see these things happening, I think you can start pointing to things and you can start understanding how people go about making difficult decisions, and we see reflections of character. And I mean, I think this is something that I know when I was an undergraduate at Colby and you were president there, that I saw this. I mean, we worked together on a number of things. I gotta ask you about one of those things, and I'm sort of springing this on you. But so when I was a sophomore at Colby, this was in 2002 or 2003. We could smoke in the dorms on campus, and I thought this was awful, like absolutely horrible. And so I was on the student government and brought up this proposal to sort of end smoking in the dorms on campus, and it was killed. No one liked it. Right, this thing was voted down like 17-2 or something. And so, people who know me know I'm not a big fan of the rules. And so I went to the director of the health center and said, all these people are smoking in our dorms, it's horrible. We marched up to your office and you couldn't believe it. And within a couple of weeks, we ended smoking in the dorms. And so here's a decision where when you were sort of confronted by this, I think your response was simply like, this is clearly the best thing to do, get over it, students. But I don't know if you remember, but the students were really upset about this for some reason. And so someone in your position, when, the students in some ways are customers at colleges and universities, but it's not just the 18-year-old version, it's the 35-year-old version of those students as well. When you were faced with those kind of decisions, and perhaps there are other stories you'd like to share, but how do you go about making a decision? I mean, maybe the smoking one is, I think everyone looks back on it because that was the right decision. But other decisions that are more difficult, how do you go about weighing some of those things if we're talking about leadership? Because ultimately you're responsible for all those decisions. You're responsible for the blowback. What goes through your mind? And maybe there's another story you could tell that, but I think people would, I know I'd be really interested to hear, how you go about making these decisions.
I definitely remember that moment and that decision. And I would have to say that it wasn't the most consultative decision I've ever made. I was, as you were, kind of appalled that this was still going on. And I had some personal health history that fed into my reaction to this. But I was also just becoming a member of the board of governors of the local hospital. So I was pretty far into healthcare and professional issues in healthcare. And I knew how significant was the impact of smoking on health and the expense of health and the way hospitals function. So I was thinking about this not just from my own personal history, but from the point of view of sort of public health issues in the United States. And it just seemed to me utterly crazy that this was still happening. And of course, 2 years later or 3 years later, nobody could smoke anywhere. Even, and ultimately, of course, in New York, where I lived a couple of years ago, you can't smoke in parks. You can't smoke on beaches. People do, but so the question is enormously. I guess in that case, I felt I had really good reasons that were not just personal, but that were publicly demonstrable and relevant, and that I could explain to people as I made the decision. Some people were convinced by these public health arguments, by the fact that the university pays, or the college was paying for healthcare, and the risk of other people, the risk to other people of this behavior. That doesn't make many 19 or 20-year-olds very happy, by the way, as you probably witnessed at the time. But I think it was thinking about all those things and what the right thing to do was. And once you have a sense of what the right thing to do is, the question is, how do you do it? And I have to say that there are some right things that you know are right that you just can't do because you can't bring enough people along quickly enough to make it happen without some kind of enormous cost. And that's where I think you talked about Aristotle. I remember another great figure in the history of philosophy, Machiavelli. You know, Machiavelli has this very contentious, sort of theory about knowing when you can't do something that's good, when you just can't get it done because the cost of doing it is too high. And there's a kind of a third eye that you need to have, hopefully looking clearly down on you at what you're doing. And you have to assess whether or not things can happen. I think now of governors of states, for example, and county leaders of counties and cities particularly, and the decisions they're having to make about confinement, restrictions, returning to normal life, all of these things. And they're weighing these enormously difficult questions that have all kinds of energy attached to them out in the public. And getting it wrong could be devastating. But you can get it wrong in several ways. You can move too slowly, you can move too quickly. You have to think about the complicated public perceptions of what you're doing. And so you have to make all these decisions based upon whether or not, in the end, you can make something stick. In that case, in the case you brought up, it was pretty clear to me that it was okay to be autocratic about that, which I think I probably was. But there are other things where you just can't do that. You have to bring people along. You have to set the problem up. You have to bring people into your thinking. You have to bring the world to you, and you have to engage people where they are. So it's a highly varied thing, and that's what's so hard about leadership. Excuse me, in concrete situations, because it's very context specific, and it depends on enormously complicated factors. The problem I have with leadership studies is that it sometimes seems to people that it is some magical property like charisma, right? That, I don't know, some people have it, some people don't have it. I don't think that's very helpful. I think Aristotle's view of look to a good leader and try to discern what it is they're doing. And I think that is possible. I think you can look at someone who's made an important decision that's worked out, and you can make sense of what they did and how they did it, and you can probably teach some of that. But in the moment, leaders do not always know that it's going to work out. And so dealing with that ambiguity and that contingency is, I think, one of the most difficult and sort of wrenching aspects of making fateful decisions, particularly in public places.
Yeah, I think anyone looking back right now would say you were on the right side of the smoking decision. But you look at 15, 17 years ago, whatever it was, and there were a lot of students that were upset. A lot of students who didn't smoke. It's a lot of libertarians, at least when it comes to decisions about their own lives.
Almost every 20-year-old or 19-year-old is a libertarian in some way,
Well, and then you do things like you have children, and then you say, you know what, there are certain things that we're not going to allow you to do. But look, I mean, you made this comment about that there are times that that you're right, but that you just can't do it because of the cost or because you can't bring people around. So you ran the NEH for a while, president of 2 colleges. Anything that you can talk about where you look back and say, you know what, I was right on that, but I just couldn't do it, and how you kind of work through that?
Oh yeah, I mean, there were lots of times. Um, I mean, at any age, sort of the always complicated question was, you know, you're living in a highly charged political environment in Washington, and you're making decisions about mostly programmatic things. What is the agency doing? What is it not doing? What do you think we ought to be doing? And what is the likelihood that what you ought to be doing? What is the likelihood that it's actually going to work out? And is it possible? I mean, we face those decisions. I face those decisions kind of constantly. I was very interested in this concept of the common good and how the humanities participate in the elaboration of the common good. It was a hard question to think about then. It's even much harder now, I would say. But you always had to be thinking about the way this would refract and reflect in that highly charged and divided political environment. So there were lots of times when I had to make decisions about grants, for example, about projects that came to my desk that were inflected by the political environment and the danger that the agency was always in with respect to its future funding. So as a public agency, I always had to be thinking about not just, is this a great idea? Because there were many of those, but is this an idea that will cause some kind of disruption and finally bring about some kind of threat to the agency itself? Those were painful decisions, but it was the coin of the realm. I mean, it was the way things worked. And I had to always be thinking about where and how others would see what we were doing, notwithstanding the fact that I had conviction about the rightness of something. So I got pretty accustomed to that routine. And I made some decisions about certain projects that, I felt terrible about at the time. But I felt reasonably sure that part of my job was to protect the agency, which of course has come under much more intense scrutiny from the administration since then. When I was there, it was pretty much the scrutiny was in Congress. The Obama administration was very reasonably friendly to everything we did because I think they believed in the cultural agencies. But now, the administration, of which the cultural agencies are a part, doesn't think very much of the cultural agencies. So it's even tougher now. But those kinds of decisions were always in the wind. Colby, I know there were some like that. I'm trying to, kind of reach back and think about them. They weren't as routine as they were in the governmental setting, but they were there. They were always there.
You raise an interesting point about the intersection between politics and academic research and funding. And this is, folks have raised all sorts of questions when, especially now, when you start looking at colleges and universities that are certainly going to be under some budget crunches with the current pandemic and its effects. Do you see that being an issue broadly, the role of money in academic research, or do you think that this is something that's been overblown? And I mention this because over the last couple of years, there have been a number of articles in the Chronicle and other pieces raising some concerns about funding sources. And you look at something like the NEH, and it's government funding, but ultimately it's people like you and others who are making decisions on what projects get funded and which projects don't get funded. And then obviously we've got a lot of private organizations that are also making similar decisions about what projects get funded and which projects don't get funded. And if you're a scientist or you're a researcher in the social sciences or humanities and you get your project funded, now you've got publications that allow you to advance your career. And if you don't get your project funded, then it's much tougher. Any general thoughts about that? You know, time as a college president, time as chair of the NEH?
Well, I mean, research funding, particularly, and I mean, research funding in the humanities is pretty inexpensive. It's pretty efficient. You don't need vast sums of money to do research in the humanities, though you do need a steady and predictable source of funding for humanities research. The most complicated projects we ever did were probably archaeological projects, which are kind of inherently expensive because they involve lots of people and travel and all those kinds of things. But in the sciences, you know, it's scientific research is fabulously expensive. And, you know, the NIH and the National Science Foundation, the combined funding of those two agencies when I was in Washington was about $50 billion. The grand total of the funding in the humanities and the arts was about $500 million. So you can sense the difference in scale. There were parts of the science funding at NIH and at NSF that were politically very charged. So the social sciences, which were in some cases funded by NSF, some of those programs were very politically charged, and they had been dampened down over time because of their controversy in Congress and also out in the country as a whole. And there was some scientific, very, you know, recognizably natural scientific funding, particularly in the world of genes and reproductive technology. That was also quite controversial. But the funding there is just, I mean, it's a very expensive enterprise, and the country has to be invested in it, which it is. I think generally, this is not quite the point of your question, but, you know, money in higher education has become an enormous issue. And higher education is a very expensive enterprise, partly because of its research function, but not just that. It's also expensive to teach students in the way that we want to teach them. So money has become very, very important. And it's meant that both state sources of funding and private sources of funding have become more and more important over time, to the point where in private institutions, wealth and the promise of donations from wealth has become, some people would say, too influential. And in other settings, public settings, that money from legislatures, which has been dwindling for decades, also drives institutions to make certain kinds of decisions that they otherwise wouldn't make. And private philanthropy in public institutions is becoming now more and more important, because public institutions are withdrawing from the funding of public higher education. So money is a constant, inevitable, and very major feature of influence in higher education. And it's one of the things that presidents have to deal with.
Yeah, and it's not just higher education too, right? When we're thinking about the influence of money and the influence of politics, we see this at you know, the K through 12 level too, when it comes to state funding for public schools, not just you know, where the money is going and how it's spent, but then how they determine who gets it. When you look at things like assessment, and I wonder, I mean, I imagine you've thought a decent bit about assessment at the college level. I mean, when you're at a Colby or a Bucknell, you probably worry less about the accrediting agencies than when you're at, say, a mid-tier state school. But do you have any concerns about what liberal arts colleges and universities, or just universities generally, are doing when it comes to assessment and how it's affecting the humanities? Because, and I think some of this is driven by money. It's driven by what success looks like. It's driven by, you know, measurable outcomes, right? How do you think that's affecting the humanities? Because it seems like between the desire for measurable outcomes and cramming more people in classes. You're seeing introduction to philosophy classes that have 100 people in it, where you're doing multiple choice tests and you've got to somehow assess the students meaningfully. Actually, that's not right. You have to assess them in a way that can be put into a rubric. I mean, it seems like colleges and universities are going in this direction, this assessment-driven direction. How do you think that's affecting the liberal arts in turn? Is it? And if so, how do you think it might affect the ability to help inculcate the skills and abilities that we were talking about before?
Well, it certainly had an impact, and I've seen it over my career. I mean, when I started my career in higher education, almost nobody talked about assessment. And when I finished it, everybody was talking about assessment. And we had to start taking it pretty seriously. And I think if you look at the escalation of the cost of the product, you don't have to think about that very long before understanding that as things become much more expensive and demand much more from parents and governments, you understand why people would start to scratch their heads and say, okay, this is a big investment. What are we getting for the investment? And how do we know that the investment is paying off? Politicization obviously makes that even more complicated, because a lot of people don't like what goes on in universities in other ways and against the grain of their own politics. But I think it's inevitable that this pressure will continue to grow. And I think it's inevitable that even in the humanities, we're going to have to come to terms with it better than we have in the past. At the same time, I think there are certain forms of assessment that, with the humanities in particular, and the arts, I would say, don't make a lot of sense and can't be pursued in the same way that they might be able to be pursued in other disciplines that are more quantifiable, if I can put it that way. So it's a tough moment of passage in thinking through how we are more responsive to parents and publics who want to know, on the one hand, and teachers and administrators who understand that there is only so much quantifiable, measurable outcome that we can demonstrate. Going back to your very first question, I think that's why people in the liberal arts and in the humanities in particular need to find a way of talking more directly to this question of work readiness, and why we need to open ourselves up to that and sort of occupy that ground in ways that we find congenial before it's occupied for us by others. So working on that issue, I think, is important, even as it causes people discomfort. It does cause people discomfort, partly because the humanities always have this sort of critical mission, right? You're not just trying to teach people how to become a part of something. You're trying to teach people how to look at the rest of their lives and the institutions they're going to be involved with, and to ask important questions about them. So there's a kind of a distance there, an applied distance, that you can't entirely let go of. But I think we can be more thoughtful about it. And I think we need to be more thoughtful about it, because the numbers aren't getting better. I mean, you know that enrollments in the humanities and the arts continue to go down in colleges and universities. And majors in what we would recognize to be liberal arts institutions are also declining pretty dramatically. And liberal arts colleges in particular are under enormous pressure, financially and every other way. So we've got to turn the ship. We've got to turn the ship in some way that we can live with and that we think complements what we do well. And that's why I was suggesting we need to think not just about skills and capacities, we also need to be thinking about forms of knowledge and understanding that lend themselves to talking more about the workplace. For example, in philosophy, I don't know if you ever took a course on work. I never even saw a course on work being taught in philosophy. Now, work, philosophically, is a hugely interesting topic. I mean, you know, it occupies a huge part of most people's lives. It's full of questions about meaning and purpose. It is hugely interesting philosophically, but we never talk about it philosophically, or we almost never talk about. I mean, I suppose you could say that Marx is
That's what I was going to say.
the philosopher of work. But think about it. I mean, apart from Marx, in the great tradition of, unless you consider the political economists philosophers, which I suppose they are, you know, it hasn't been a big part of, certainly hasn't been a big part of American philosophy. So that's a for instance, you know, we should be teaching students how to think about work as well as how to work. You know what I mean? It's a subject for critical thought as well as preparatory thought.
Yeah, and it's a tough situation for colleges and universities too, because as you know, you use the analogy of turning a ship. I mean, for all the talk about college faculty and administrators being far on the left in this country, colleges and universities are incredibly conservative institutions. Right. That it takes a lot to make even small cultural changes at a college or a university, just because of how the institution is structured and who is there and who makes decisions and how they're made them. So you're not that you're looking for a job running another college, but let's say that you were going to start a college or university and didn't have, you didn't inherit a faculty, you didn't inherit a certain culture, you didn't inherit all of the things that university administrators now inherit. What would you do? I mean, you've identified a number of challenges with colleges, universities now. Are there any dramatic changes that you would implement and say, look, I'm starting this new college or university. Everyone else is doing it this way, and they can't change it because of the culture of colleges and universities. I'm setting up a new one. We're gonna implement it or start it with this new change. Anything that you would say, this would be one of those things that you know is right, but that it's really tough to do when you're in the position of college president. But if you started a new university, you could do it maybe?
It's a long list of things. I mean, going back to this topic of readiness and work readiness, you know, I think it would be interesting to develop a curriculum that included that concept, but from the point of view of the liberal arts and sciences. Now, there are other things you have to do in those liberal arts and science contexts. You have to think and actually develop what Danielle Allen calls participation readiness. You know, we have colleges have a civic responsibility, and it's hugely important to their identity. One of I think the really alarming things about where colleges are going is that we're losing touch with that civic readiness or participation readiness concept. So restoring the fundamental priority of this multi-purposed kind of education, I think, is important. Now, you wouldn't need a brand new college to do that in some places. I don't think at Colby you would need to do that. The other thing I would do, now that you mention it, is I would insist that the undergraduate curriculum at this new college not be driven by or formed around the graduate school curriculum, which I think has been the case in most disciplines for a very long period of time. So PhDs like yourself, like me, are trained, well, I wasn't trained in a very conventional way, but most PhDs are trained in graduate school in a very conventional way that has to do with periodization and subfields within disciplines. And you write your dissertation on a subfield, you know, romantic literature in in England between X and Y. And you come fully formed in that way into an undergraduate environment. And guess what you teach? You teach what you know. You teach your specialization, or you teach subfields or subspecializations. And that's the way the undergraduate curriculum has been driven. And I would just turn that completely upside down. I think the undergraduate curriculum should be driven by these fundamental educational purposes, and everybody has to have a stake in that. And you have to imagine teaching philosophy to all students, every student, not just the ones who you think might go on to graduate school, not just the ones who you think might be interested in medieval literature in France. You've got to teach every student to think philosophically, or that should be your goal. I think another thing I would do is I would insist upon the integration of the divisions of knowledge, the sciences, the social sciences, the humanities, and the arts, and develop integrative curricula that force scientists and humanists and social scientists into constant collaboration and conversation. Because I think that's what it's all about. Look at what this crisis we're in now requires in the way of understanding. You have to have some kind of grip on science. You can't listen to this conversation about what's happening with this disease or this virus without being able to appreciate what science says about the problem. At the same time, you've got to understand some of the policy implications and the political implications, the economic implications. And you've got to have some kind of understanding about the meaningfulness of this disease and the way it plays out in personal lives and personal dimensions of people's lives. It's a perfect case of interdisciplinary thinking and understanding and knowledge. And you can't really grasp the problem unless you see it from those different vantage points. So I would insist upon a curriculum that was integrative constantly and all the time. Those are two.
Yeah, no, and that's, I think of, say, all universities have some sort of general education requirements where students are taking, say, so many science classes or so many social science classes. And you think about it, all of those classes, the vast majority of students in those classes, that's the only chemistry class this student's ever going to get, or that's the only philosophy class the student's ever going to have. This is the only sociology class the student's going to have. We teach those classes, say the chemistry class, like all the students in the class are going to be chemistry majors.
Right.
And so the students who come out of it and who aren't going to be chemistry majors, they don't see how what they're doing in that class connects to anything in the world around them. And if you think about what the purpose of general education is supposed to be at a college or university, it's supposed to be trying to form this whole that allows the science part of you to talk to the philosophy part of you, to talk to the history part of you, and then to understand how these things all get applied to real world problems. And I'm with you if there's a way to figure out how to do that, because I think one of the criticisms that we see of college, especially over the last, 40, 50 years in this country, is that as we start pushing more people to go to college, right, that we say everyone needs to go to college in this country. And a lot of people associated with colleges and universities have continued to push that, because I think a lot of them genuinely believe that, but obviously there's a financial incentive that's driving that as well. But as soon as you push college for all, you're doing two things, right? You're saying, one, we've got to provide something that everyone can participate in. And so it's not just about academic elites, it's about everyone. But then you also seem to have an obligation to them, which is to give them something of value. And what you're talking about in providing people with an integrated learning approach to the world seems to get that. I mean, I guess, so one of the things that I wonder is, do you think that this push, and this is a little bit disconnected, but do you think that this push for college for all has had a negative effect on the university? And given that we have made it so easy for people to go to college in terms of being able to take out loans and whatever else, and we are pushing people there. Do you think that we have either a greater obligation to take that step that you're talking about, or if we can't, or if we're failing at that, do you think we should be ratcheting down or attempting to ratchet down this this push to get everyone to go to college?
I guess to the latter question, I would say no, I don't think we should ratchet it down. I'm not sure that anyone who's advocating on that side of the divide would say everyone, absolutely everyone, has to go to college. But I think I subscribe to the argument that we need to be better than where we are, which is what, 60%, something like that, 60% going, even less than that graduating. That the kind of economy we're in, the kind of society we're in, argues for more people being able to go to college. And of course, we know that they do much better in the economy when they have college behind them. On the other hand, I think we think about this too monologically. We think about it as college as one thing, and of course, it's not one thing. For example, at NEH, I got to be much more familiar with the junior college or community college system. Incredibly important, incredibly impressive system of higher education. And we have to think about all of these parts of the puzzle as we push for more and more students going to college. And we have to provide the resources to community colleges in order for them to succeed. And of course, they work with almost nothing compared to other institutions of higher education. So we have to be sensitive, I think, to the diverse elements of higher education and to the work that each and every one of them does. By the way, the only place in the country, the only sector in the country where humanities concentrations are increasing is in community colleges. Everywhere else, they're declining. Now, there's something really interesting going on there. Part of it is that a very high percentage of community college students go on to four-year institutions. And four-year institutions like to see a kind of a breadth of the two-year experience. So that helps with humanities enrollments. But there's something else that's going on in community colleges and the humanities that's really interesting. So I would continue to press for higher education, but it needs to be accessible. We have to make it accessible to students. And we have to reinforce our commitment to all of the sectors of higher education that do the work that we need to have done. There was another part to your question that I'm...
Yeah, but what do you mean by so accessible, right? So right now, I mean, it's expensive, right? It's expensive both in dollars and in time. And time obviously can equate to dollars.
Sure.
What do you think needs to be done to make it more accessible? Is it just simply, look, it should be a national priority, throw more tax dollars at it? Or do you mean something beyond that when it comes to accessibility?
Well, I mean, a couple of things. I mean, you know, the states in the United States have been pulling away from higher education for 25 years financially. And they can't expect to do that and make college, university experiences more accessible. I mean, they're becoming less accessible because they're becoming more expensive. So there needs to be some kind of reorientation of priorities in state budgets that take this seriously. Private institutions, here I'm sort of speaking, I suppose, out of both sides of my mouth, but private institutions have to focus more on accessibility as well. And they have to constrain their costs and the increases in their costs in a way that they haven't done before. So a place like Colby, you know, what is it now? $70,000? I don't know, I've lost track. Now there's a huge amount of financial aid being given out. So the sticker price is not the price that most student or half the students pay. But still, it's a very expensive endeavor. And some of that expense is not related essentially or fundamentally to the educational product. You know, my favorite pet peeve is athletics and sort of the expense of athletic programs across higher education in the United States. I'm a you know a huge, a very tiny minority in that conversation, but that's a for instance of the way in which cost has accelerated in the United States for reasons that don't have much to do with the educational mission of institutions. So I think both at the state level and private levels, more has to be done in containing the cost of the experience.
So if you were starting that university from nothing, you're not having an athletics program. You might have some intramurals or you might have some club teams, but we've from your perspective, we've gone too far at colleges and universities when it comes to something like athletics.
Absolutely. In fact, when I started my graduate school at the University of California, Santa Cruz, there were no athletics. It was club only. And I actually played one of the club sports. I played club rugby. And it was great. You know, we had a good experience. We competed, but sort of casually. And, you know, as soon as Santa Cruz started experiencing enrollment pressures in the late 70s and early 80s, they gave that up and they started an intercollegiate athletic program so they could compete with Berkeley and UCLA and, you know, others who had athletic programs. But I liked the old Santa Cruz better than the new Santa Cruz.
But so how hard would that be to do? So you were the president of Colby. If something like that could be done anywhere, it might be able to be done at Colby. You know, be careful. You're speaking with a Division III varsity golfer here, right? But of course, I didn't go to Colby to play golf. I had no idea there was even a golf team. I didn't play.
You're making my point.
I know. I didn't realize it until my sophomore year. I was playing my freshman year. I played with someone else's clubs who was on the golf team. He said, "I'm on the golf team. You should come play." And I said, "We have a golf team?" But how difficult would it have been, or would it be, if you're the president of a school like Colby, to eliminate athletics? Because it seems like that's one of these moves that, you know, you might be right, but it's just the cost might be too high.
Yeah, no, it's impossible. You can't do it. What you could do is you could ratchet it down, you know, 5 or 10 levels, and sustain a true Division III kind of program that didn't cost what these current programs cost. But no, getting rid of it is totally impossible. But golf, now, I mean, with all due respect, golf at Colby was, you know, pretty close to a club sport. I mean, you know, I went out and played with the golf team, as you know, and, you know, I could have played on the golf team. I wasn't very good. So, so you know, it was my ideal of sort of the Division III kind of sporting team or program.
It was great. Look, and I wasn't very good either, right? And so, you know, it was one of those things where you meet some friends, you go play after class, maybe you play in a tournament every couple of weekends, but we weren't competitive at all. And it's difficult for me. I mean, I went from Colby to Boston University, where I had students in my introduction to philosophy class that were on the hockey team and they were being drafted by NHL teams. I mean,
Right.
that was a completely different environment. But you look at Colby, you say, you know, no one from Colby is going on to compete professionally. So let me ask you a final question I've got for you, and this is sort of a change of subject a little bit. You know, one of the things that we're seeing right now in our country is with divisive political discourse. And one of the things that I would hope a liberal arts education does, whether it's being done at the high school level or the college level, is helping people on the left or the right or all different sides to recognize that you can have differences of opinion with people, and those can be intelligent, respectful differences, and that just because someone holds a different view than you do on, say, economics or political issues doesn't make that person a bad person. Where do you think we might be going wrong here if you do? Because one of the concerns I have is that it seems that when you look at discourse on college campuses, excuse me, when you look at discourse on college campuses, it's often at a lot of liberal arts colleges where you see the students trying to crack down on open discourse. And it seems like you have a lot of folks that are either very sensitive or I'm not sure what the word is. You know what I'm talking about. Like, where do you think we've gone wrong at this, if you do? And if so, how do you think we might go about trying to fix that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm not sure I have a very compelling answer, but I agree that it's a problem, and it's become much more difficult since you left, Colby. The division and the intolerance became much worse, and there were some very widely distributed stories about things that happened at a number of liberal arts colleges in the last couple of years. One event at Middlebury, for example, where a social scientist was, sort of forced off the stage and couldn't speak, and other comparable events. There is a kind of pervasive intolerance, mostly and weirdly expressed by people on the left for other points of views. And the irony of that, of course, is that wasn't so long ago in American political history when intolerance was being expressed by folks on the right in, say, the McCarthy era, which we thought had been sort of indelibly burned into people's memories. Well, not so much. I mean, it wasn't so indelibly burned into people's memories. And here we have, ironically, students who are generally self-proclaimed members of the left, exercising that kind of intolerance. I'm not sure I understand completely how that happened, but there has been a kind of intolerant positioning of groups on the left on college campuses, and a sort of pervasive political correctness that has been generated on many campuses that has really been, I think, very destructive of some of the larger goals and aspirations of education in those settings. Making clear your objection to somebody you regard as an objectionable speaker is part of the speech of college campuses. Making it impossible for somebody to exercise speech in that way is totally unacceptable. And we've got to find a way to kind of turn that around and to preserve an environment on colleges and university campuses where that fundamental give and take around difficult issues can take place. Now, it's not helped, of course, by the intervention of external groups, most famously at Berkeley and some other places recently, where people who have no interest in any kind of conversation were coming into campus environments and doing their best to do damage and to injure the university and to injure other people, in fact. And that's happened from both the right and the left. I mean, that's a political problem that exists in the world without respect to what's going on campuses, but it's complicated, especially in big university settings like Berkeley. It's complicated, the work there. But at a place like Colby or a small liberal arts college, it's mostly an internal conversation. And it's really the establishment of standards of discourse, as you put it, that the college has to defend. And it's not easy, but the college has to do it. And I think it's got to start very early when students show up and say, look, this is the way this place works. And it doesn't work if we can't observe these fundamental lines of respect and civility. It's going back to, Aristotle and the kind of original meanings of that word. It's how do you live with civility in the midst of very strong differences? Hard.
Yeah,
I mean, we don't model it very well in the political world.
Yeah, and it's tough to say what's happened to, when I think you probably remember when I was there, we brought in all sorts of fun people, Charles Murray, we brought in Andrew Sullivan. I think I was somehow involved in bringing in Coulter to campus, although that probably shouldn't have happened. But that was,
but let's think about a couple of those people. Murray, who caused the dust up, but not who caused, who was the occasion for the dust up at Middlebury. Somebody like Ann Coulter, who's sort of a bomb thrower in any case. Yeah, and maybe, I don't know. I can understand someone saying that Ann Coulter isn't coming to Colby with the purpose of, helping me understand the world. That's probably not what she's doing there. But somebody came when I was there who wanted to debate me on the stage, and I declined. Who was that? It was one of these right-wing, it was like Ann Coulter. It wasn't Ann Coulter.
Was it Dinesh D'Souza? Did he want to do that?
No, it wasn't him either.
Him? Okay.
But, I declined because I didn't want to be part of a circus, in what I knew would become a circus. But there has to be some way in which, we can entertain these strongly dissonant ideas and listen to other people express them. Maybe not Ann Coulter, but,
Well, and I think you make a good point, right? There's some of this that is both on the left and the right, because I think Ward Churchill may have come to Colby when I was there, that there's some of this it's a performance art, right? And I don't think that Charles Murray thinks that what he's doing is performance art, but what Ann Coulter is doing is, but I think you touched on something in terms of you've got to set the conversation up so that it's civil and productive. And so when you bring, say, Andrew Sullivan to campus, who I don't think Andrew Sullivan thinks what he does is performance art, and we filled Coulter. We had 150 people, 200 people show up to listen to Andrew Sullivan, a Republican, talk about same-sex marriage. And people are again like, oh, Chris, you made a really good call bringing him. I said, this is 2004 when we did that. And you could just imagine the protests for that would happen now if, well, we know what happened with Charles Murray, but other people who are bringing controversial ideas, and none of that happened when we were. And this is not that long ago. I mean, I don't think I'm that old. This seems.
Oh, you're not. You're right. It got much worse after you left, and it's going to continue to get worse, I think. And so we've got to find a way of dealing with it. I participated in an international conference in Strasbourg last year, and I talked some about this in that environment, and the Europeans, are sort of stunned that this was going on the left. That's what was, I think, so stunning to a lot of the European university people.
Well, hopefully we can figure out how to fix this going forward, because as you say, I think being able to have these substantive and constructive conversations from people on all sides with, at the end of the conversation, either going out to dinner or having those conversations over dinner where you recognize you can have political or economic disagreements with people, but that having that disagreement doesn't make them a bad person. Having that type of dialogue seems to be central to the liberal arts experience. So hopefully we can do it. But look, thank you so much for your time today. Really always enjoyed talking with you. And thank you for taking the time to us. Appreciate it.
It's great to see you after these years, and really admire what you're doing, and wish you the best.
Well, thank you. And at some point soon, we'll have to get back on the golf course because I owe you a round of golf from our time at Colby.
I'm looking forward to seeing you in New Orleans.
Sounds great. Well, thank you also to Brad Jackson, the Institute for Humane Studies, and thank you for all you hear. Brad's asked me to encourage you, if you're listening to this, to fill out the survey that IHS is going to send you afterwards. And for those of you who have been asking questions that I was able to ask President Adams, thank you so much for that. And then hopefully you can join us in 2 weeks when we talk with Daniela Strupe from Chapman. So take care and have a good rest of the day.